All right, everyone, we will get started in just a sec. Chrissy, I'm not sure if your hand raise was intentional. I'm happy to, it looks like it was perhaps not. Okay, all good. All right. One more minute. I know we're at 150 folks here. It's fantastic to have all of you joining us for this informative event. We're really excited to have our presenters share their great knowledge of the statewide and then the Denver ballot initiatives. So we will get rolling with that in just a moment. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everybody. As I mentioned at the beginning, just a moment ago, we are so excited to welcome you. The Junior League of Denver is so excited to welcome you to Wine and Ballots. Our agenda for this evening, first I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Allie Coleman-Wagner, and I'm a member of the Public Policy Council, your event hosts for this evening. What we're doing this evening, this training will feature a deep dive of ballot measures with impartial analysis to help our members and friends understand the purpose and effect of each measure prior to voting. This training is going to give a nonpartisan overview on all ballot measures and help us understand how various ballot measures impact you, your community, and the state of Colorado. Then we'll have a deeper dive discussion on a few key ballot measures in the Denver area as well. All right. So, as some grounding for the evening, our goal and focus before we begin our training, for our guests and for our members alike, I want to give a brief overview of the Junior League of Denver. The JLD is an organization of women committed to promoting volunteerism, developing the potential of women, and improving communities through effective action and leadership of trained volunteers. Its purpose is exclusively educational and charitable. The focus of the Junior League of Denver is to disrupt the cycle of systemic poverty for women and families in Denver. And our goal is to amplify advocacy efforts to engage more members and create lasting community change. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are doing the hosts for this event this evening is the JLD Public Policy Council. The Public Policy Council works to influence and shape policy at the state legislature, focusing on policies that impact our mission, our members, and our community partners. We are one of the few leagues in the country with the Public Policy Council, and I believe we were also the first. We also provide training opportunities and empower our members to engage as advocates for their communities. We have designed this training for you to understand the purpose and effect of each measure before you're voting. And a couple of things on screen I just want to highlight. We have the Q&A should be open to you all throughout the evening. We really encourage you to use it. As you are doing that, if you're a league member, I encourage you to wear your league hat, which means being nonpartisan and focusing on the content of the issues. We will be doing the same, as will our presenters throughout the evening. Okay. Overview. As I mentioned, we're a nonpartisan organization and council. It's in here a couple of times because we want to make sure it's really, really clear. If you've got questions, please ask them in the Q&A. We'll be asking our presenters the questions. We'll go ahead and pose those out loud to them. We'll follow up on unanswered questions after the training and post them to the Public Policy Council webpage, which is, I believe, linked on this slide. If not, we will follow up with an email after the fact to make sure that it's clear where you can get your questions answered. The other thing, the wine part of Wine and Ballots this evening, don't forget to use your wine discount, JLD20. We are partnered with Blanchard Family Wines. They provide this code will provide 20% off your purchase of wine and 30% for orders of 6 or more bottles. You can purchase online using the online store or in their tasting room, or hopefully you've brought some wine with you this evening as we settle in for our discussion. So without further ado, I will stop talking and bring in some fabulous presenters. This evening, we're going to hear presentations from Julia Jackson and Katie Rudebush from the Colorado Legislative Council about the Colorado statewide ballot measures. And then we'll also hear from Julia Scanlon and Iris Hensey from Aponte and Busam for an overview of the remaining local Denver ballot initiatives. So let's hear a little bit about Julia. Julia Jackson is currently the ballot analysis lead for Legislative Council staff, responsible for overseeing the preparation and production of the state ballot information booklet, commonly known as the Blue Book. Julia has worked for LCS since 2010 as a researcher and as a committee staffer with extensive experience in elections policy, and she also served as staff for Colorado's first independent redistricting commission in 2021. She came to Colorado by way of Nevada, California, and Washington, D.C., and she lives in the Park Hill neighborhood of Denver with her husband, dog, and 2 school-age children. So thank you so much for joining us today, Julia, and now I will hand it over to you. And as I'm doing that, I will switch over to your slides.
Katie and I are actually going to alternate. I don't know if it makes sense to introduce her now too.
Well, then
We'll be going
yes,
back and forth.
then yes, it does. Let me do that real quick before we get too much further down the path. All right. All right, Katie will also be, as Julie mentioned, trading off. Katie is the Policy and Research Section Manager with Legislative Council staff. She oversees the section that staffs most of the legislature's committees during session and year-round and conducts nonpartisan research. Katie has worked on issues related to legislative committee process, transportation, education, and information technology. She earned a bachelor's degree from Emory University and a JD from the University of Denver. So now I'll hand it over to the 2 of them to share more about the statewide ballot initiatives. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here this evening. And here are your slides.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
All good.
And you can just skip ahead to the next one. I like to start these talks. Hi, I'm Julia. I like to start by kind of going over what's on the ballot and how we got here with the Blue Book. So we've listed what you will find on your ballot this year. Election day is November 5th. Ballots are mailed between October 11th and 18th. You've hopefully already gotten your Blue Book. Just some quick facts about the Blue Book. We mail them to about 2 million registered voter households in Colorado. This is a big year. We counted 48 members of our staff at Legislative Council who worked on the book this year. The bilingual book, which is what you got if you live in Denver or Adams County, is the biggest we've ever printed. We had to switch to a different binding to accommodate it. This was a weird year where some things were maybe going to be on the ballot and then weren't at the last minute. And you can see kind of the order of the ballot with this here. You'll go through your federal offices, your state offices. If you're not in Denver, some counties and municipal offices are up this year, and all your judicial retention. And then you will get to ballot initiatives, ballot measures, which is what we're here to talk about today. Statewide ballot measures appear in a particular order. It's like the federal government. The state has a constitution and statutes or laws. The legislature writes the statutes, but they can't change the constitution without approval from you, the voters. So anytime the legislature wants to change the constitution, they have to refer those measures to the voters. That requires 2/3 votes in both the state Senate and the state House. And then in most cases, you they have to pass with 55% of the vote statewide. So on your ballot, you'll see constitutional amendments referred by the legislature first. Those are going to be your amendment with a letter. They start with Amendment G this year. And then constitutional amendments initiated by the people, which are amendment and a number. Initiated measures are things put forth not by the legislature, but by citizens of Colorado. In order to get on the ballot, they have to go through a process of review and getting a title set, and then they have to collect signatures. It's just under 125,000 signatures that they have to collect statewide. For these constitutional amendments, those have to be distributed amongst the 35 state Senate districts. So a portion of your signatures have to come from each state Senate district to kind of spread them out geographically. So after your constitutional amendments, we have statutory measures and questions referred by the legislature, and then statutory measures and questions initiated by the people. Those are called propositions when they're changing the statutes. The propositions with the double letters come from the legislature. The propositions with the numbers come from the people. And then after your statewide measures, you'll have local measures. They always appear referred measures from whatever the government is, the city or the county or whatever, and then initiated. And they go in the order of county, municipal, school districts, and then special districts. And they have these numbers in front of them. So like your Denver measures might be 2R, and I think the RTD one is 7A because RTD is a special district. So that's kind of the order of things. And with that, we're going to dive into the 14 measures on the statewide ballot. So I'm going to start with the first one, and then Katie and I are going to mostly swap them off, but it's based on what we know more about. So they're not entirely one-on-one or one-to-one. Amendment G modifies the homestead exemption, which is a property tax exemption for veterans with disabilities. The homestead exemption reduces the amount owed on your property tax in some cases. Mostly applies to seniors who have lived in their houses for 10 or more years, but there's also a homestead exemption for Gold Star spouses and veterans who are 100% permanent and totally disabled, which is a rating you get from the Federal Veterans Administration. There is another VA rating called Total Disability Individual Unemployability, which says that the VA has found that you are not able to be employed even though you are not 100% permanent and totally disabled. So this measure would extend the existing homestead exemption for veterans to these folks who qualify for TDIU from the federal government, as well as the permanent and totally disabled veterans. The homestead exemption reduces your property taxes on average by about $590 a year. We expect this to make about 3,700 people statewide eligible for the homestead exemption who weren't previously. And that's it for this one. We can take questions after each one before we switch.
Any questions in the room, feel free to add them to the Q&A. We'll raise them forward.
And I'll also note that these kind of start with the small and easy ones and get progressively longer and more complicated. So it's okay to take it easy now.
Got a couple of questions coming in. Rachel was curious, what identifies some veterans? We'll start with that one.
So the veterans who are currently eligible for this are those that have the 100% permanent and total disability rating. The measure would add TDIU. The ratings are made by the Federal Veterans Administration, and you submit paperwork to your county assessor when you're filing your property tax saying that you have this rating from the VA that qualifies for you.
Perfect, thank you. And then Someone else had posed a question. I'm assuming that this does not raise any taxes for anyone else. Can you talk about a little bit about the potential?
Yeah, it does not. And in fact, property tax money generally goes to the county who's collecting it. In the case of these homestead exemptions, the state actually reimburses them. So even the counties don't actually even lose any money for these homestead exemptions in property taxes.
Great. Thank you so much. That is all of the questions we had open for this one. I think we're good to go to the next.
I will hand it off to Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie, and I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so I apologize in advance for my voice. But I'm going to talk about Amendment H, which is judicial discipline procedures and confidentiality. It was placed on the ballot by the legislature. There was some shakeup at the judicial department in 2022, and then in 2023, the legislature created an interim committee on judicial discipline, and that interim committee created 3 bills, 2 bills that were passed by the legislature, and then they sent this constitutional amendment to the ballot. Important things to remember about this is that judicial discipline is in the Constitution. So if they want to change it, that's why it's before you today. It basically does 2 things. The big thing that it does is currently there's a commission for judicial misconduct. It's called the Commission of Judicial Discipline. They screen a bunch of cases that are sent to them of people complaining about judges. I want to make it very clear that this is about the ethical conduct of judges themselves, not their actual decisions. So that's why they do a lot of screening. And so this measure creates a second board called the Independent Adjudicative Board that will then, at the commission's behest, hear and try any judicial discipline cases before it and make recommendations for a punishment. If that is appealed, it can go to the Supreme Court or a different tribunal if it involves a Supreme Court justice. Those appeals can only be related to the procedure of the tribunal. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the merit of the case. That's different than how it's currently set up. So basically, it creates this independent board of attorneys, regular people, and judges to try these cases, which sets a little bit of barrier between the Supreme Court and the judges disciplining themselves. And so it creates a more transparent process. In the current process, we do not find out what happened with the judge until the judge is actually punished. In the adjudicative board, things will become public at the time of the hearing. So it is a little complicated, but basically it just creates this extra level of transparency in the judicial discipline system. So I can take any questions.
Got a couple trickling in. The first one is asking about who would be on the panel.
So the panel is a little bit more broad than it used to be because it includes attorneys, judges, and members of the public, which did not have a part of the process before.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Nicole that's asking, is there any requirement that folks be appointed to this board from different parties or as unaffiliated members? Yeah, and then also any requirement in regards to geography.
I don't actually know the specific answer to that question, but I do know that they are appointed, who appoints them is in the Constitution, and that is the Supreme Court appoints some, and the governor appoints some, and then they all have to be confirmed by the Senate.
Thank you. That is super helpful. And we can make a note to follow up and see if we can get if there's any kind of anywhere further to go on the kind of geographic distribution part of it. That's a really good question. Okay, and I think we've gotten, we can kind of poke at this a little bit further. What are the requirements for folks who are on the panel? I know you just kind of mentioned the approval process or the nomination process, but are there particular characteristics that are required?
So that will be undertaken in another part of this that I didn't talk about is that the judicial discipline will mean the Supreme Court and a rulemaking body will go, once it's implemented, make a bunch of rules about who can qualify, probably the geography of where people can qualify. And so that is to be determined by the rules of the Supreme Court.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's a really similar question. And we've got two that are kind of overlapping. Someone has put forward just broadly, why is this something that the legislature felt was necessary? And kind of someone else pointing to, what's kind of the for and the against case for this proposition.
Yeah. So we're one of the only states that currently do it. Judges punish other judges. A lot of states have, they all do it differently, but a lot of them involve other people more in the process. So in the judicial department had a little bit of an issue a couple of years ago, and it brought to the forefront who should be disciplining the judges and how much say the Supreme Court should have in that. And should the Supreme Court, punish their own judges? And so they had the interim committee and a lot of ideas came out and they decided this would be the best way forward between the judicial branch, the judges and the legislature to kind of create this middle board that would create more transparency and allow more people to be involved in the process. I would say the major argument against is that being a judge is a very specific job with a very specific code of conduct that only judges are very versed in. And so it makes sense that they are judged by their peers because they understand the intricacies of being a judge. And so that's what we had for a long time. And so this process kind of gives more people the opportunity and takes judges a little bit more out of it. That's what I would say.
That is super clarifying. Thank you so much. That's great. And I think a couple of these other ones that are left in here are really similar to ones that have already been answered. Other than someone has posed the question of what is the effect on taxpayer costs for an additional committee like this?
Oh, that is a good question. I haven't actually, I've read the fiscal note, but it will cost. It will be a cost to the state to create this new board, but this new board isn't meeting all of the time. I want to be very clear that this impacts probably only 1% of the judicial discipline cases. Not very many cases get this far. So I don't think while it will cost some money, it won't cost a lot because it will really depend on how many cases get submitted to this adjudicative board.
So one of the things that always goes, I'm just going to stomp all over Katie here. One of the things that always goes into our blue book is a fiscal impact statement. So you can always find that at the end of each of our analyses. And we estimated that this one will increase state costs by about $50,000 a year in that fiscal impact statement.
Yeah,
that's mostly for rulemaking and training.
Yeah. It will probably depend on how many cases there actually are. And we know from the past that there are not very many.
Okay. You all have brought up a lot of great questions already. There's not anything here that hasn't already been touched on to some degree by Katie, so I think we're good to go ahead and move on to the next. And there we go, Julia.
All right, so Amendment I deals with the exceptions in the Constitution for setting bail. The Constitution says that judges have to set bail when a person is charged with a crime, but it currently gives them the option to deny bail if someone is accused of an offense for which the death penalty can be sought. The General Assembly repealed the death penalty in Colorado in 2020, so there are no longer any crimes for which the death penalty can be sought. So this measure would add back specifically first-degree murder when the judge determines that the proof is evident or a presumption is great that the person committed the crime. And in those cases, judges would then be able to deny bail. And that's it on this one.
Okay, we are We've got one question in so far. So if this did not pass, the noes took it, would every single person involved in a murder case get bail or be required to have bail set?
So I believe the answer to that is yes. There are a lot of ways to set bail to make it hard to actually get out on bail, namely by setting the bail incredibly high. So I think that is what is being relied on currently to keep people in jail.
Got it. And then kind of a parallel question of why would it make sense for bail to be denied in such cases? Or kind of what is the for argument on that?
Yeah, so our for argument on this one focuses on the idea that this was sort of a consequence of the repeal of the death penalty that maybe wasn't the legislature's intention, that this was sort of specific in the Constitution in a way that maybe they didn't realize when they were getting rid of death sentences. And our argument against is that, you know, you're innocent until proven guilty, and that pretrial detention takes away from that.
Thank you. Question from the Q&A about how, the equity implications of this. Is there any kind of discussion of how, if or how this might disproportionately affect racial minorities?
We don't estimate that this would come up that much. These cases are pretty infrequent, and not a lot of people get released on bail currently. I don't think I can speculate any further about the actual implications, except to say that this is pretty rare.
Appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. And then someone has asked about, and I'll kind of pose this as on either side of this, who are some of the groups that have weighed in on this amendment? Particularly being asked about in the chat is law enforcement groups, but is there like a kind of summary of coalitions on either side of this, knowing that that is perhaps a longer question than we have time for?
I don't know it off the top of my head, and I'm looking real quick because Secretary of State has a website that we put in the Blue Book in kind of a convoluted language that we have to use. They have a page that talks about like the official like campaigns for and against the measures. So there are no registered issue committees on either side of this one. And that's actually true for Amendment G and Amendment H and Amendment K. So a lot of these constitutional measures that come from the legislature, there's just not a lot of groups weighing in one way or the other. And I don't know the answer specifically on this one.
That is perfectly reasonable. And that's, I think the not having strong kind of weighing in on either side is itself informative. And
so
answers.
you can actually, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, this page is just titled Amendments and Propositions on the Ballot. It's a little like cumbersome to get to. I can put the link in the chat, and maybe you can like pass it along to everybody.
Perfect. Yeah, we can make a note to include that in follow-up after the fact. Two questions that came in kind of on the same topic. You mentioned that it's pretty unlikely, it's low frequency. Do you have do we have an estimated percentage of people who are able to post bail in cases where they are I don't think convicted is the word here, but charged, I suppose, is what we're going for with first-degree murder?
I don't know. So a little behind the scenes here. Katie and I worked on all but I think 2 of these measures sort of indirectly as reviewers, and this is one of the ones that neither of us worked on. So
Okay.
this is one of my weak links.
Fair enough. We've got a lot of breadth to cover still this evening, so very fair. And then just a kind of one clarification question. At this point, is anyone who has been charged with first degree murder currently being offered bail?
I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah, Katie? Yeah, Katie's nodding along with me.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I have been passing along all of these fantastic questions because I'm so excited about them, but I'm going to try and limit my chattiness on the next couple of these, knowing that we've still got 11 more of yours to go through. So thank you very much. We can hop along to Jay.
Great. Amendment J. Before I get to Amendment J, I just want to backtrack. I read the measure again for Amendment H, and it does not specify that the appointees for this adjudicative board have to come from a specific political party or geographic area. It just says who they need to be appointed by. So I want to make that clear. But going back to Amendment J is, I don't want to say simple, but it is pretty simple. Basically, in 2006, the voters of Colorado put into the Constitution that the definition of a marriage is between one man and one woman. This year, the legislature passed a resolution to put this on the ballot to strike that language from the Constitution, that only a union of one man and one woman is a valid marriage in Colorado. This one is a little interesting because since we were repealing something from the Constitution, it only passes with a majority vote. I will say that this language being in the Constitution is not currently in effect because of several Supreme Court rulings. So it currently doesn't stop anyone that is not one man and one woman from being a valid marriage in Colorado. This measure simply takes that out of the Constitution. So that's Amendment J.
Great. Any questions from the room? Someone is curious, will this language just be struck or will it be replaced with something else?
No, it will just be struck. It will no longer be in the Constitution.
Okay. Any other questions percolating? All right, well, I won't overcomplicate it because to your point, Katie, this one was a little bit more straightforward, so we can hop to the next.
All right. So Amendment K is about some election deadlines that are in the Constitution that the legislature would like to change. So there's 3 separate deadlines that this is addressing. One of them actually applies to my office. In addition to printing the Blue Book, we publish the text and titles of all the statewide ballot measures in local newspapers. Right now, that deadline is sort of nebulous in the Constitution because it's tied to voter registration deadlines. So this would just set a deadline of 30 days before the election when we would need to publish those newspaper ads. And then the other 2 move their deadlines up a week. It's the same deadline for these 2 things. One is for judges to file a declaration of intent to seek another term. Judges in Colorado are not elected, they are appointed, but they come up for retention where you, the voters, get to say this judge should keep their position or not. So they have to say that they want to seek another term before they appear on the ballot. This would move up the deadline when they have to do that by 1 week. It would also move up the deadline for citizens to submit signatures for initiatives. Signature collection is a little more complicated. When you get a petition to put a measure on the ballot, you have 6 months to collect signatures from the day you get that petition certified, except that there's this hard deadline before the election. This year it was August 5th. So this would move that final deadline a week earlier. It doesn't address the 6 months. So as long as you start early enough, you would still have those 6 months to gather petitions. But if you are waiting towards the end and you have that shortened time frame, this would move that up a week. The clerks are concerned about how much time they have to get the ballots ready before they have to be mailed, particularly for overseas voters. Ballots have to be mailed really early. So this would give them more time to proof the ballots and like get them translated and prep everything before they have to be put in the mail. That's Amendment K.
Thanks so much, Julia. And you kind of already touched on the cons of moving up the deadlines. Somebody was asking about the pros and cons. So any pros?
Yeah, so moving up the deadlines helps the clerks. It gives them more time to format and translate, and hopefully have fewer errors on the ballots because ballots are long and complicated. The argument against this that we focused on is that this would reduce the amount of time that citizens have to collect signatures. You can do it early enough that you don't lose that week, but most people do submit their signatures right up close to that deadline, so you would lose some time.
Great. And related to that, someone has pointed out that a week does seem fairly short. What influenced the recommendation for that timeline?
As far as I know, this measure came directly to the legislature from the county clerks, who are elections in Colorado are conducted locally. So the Secretary of State's office sort of coordinates statewide and comes up with the ballot language, but the county clerks run their elections. So they were the ones who asked for more time. They felt that a week was a fair middle ground, that they would still have that extra time without like taking too much away from the judge's time to deliberate and the people's time to collect signatures.
Great. And one more, hopefully quick one. Does the sooner deadline for signatures change the time frame for the title board at all?
It doesn't in this measure. It could if they wanted to. The title board deadlines and processes are in statute, so the legislature could follow up on this and make changes to conform to this deadline, but they aren't included in this constitutional measure.
Fantastic. That is super helpful and super clear. Okay. Let's hop to the next.
Great. So now, as Julia said earlier in her introduction, we're moving to constitutional amendments that were put on the ballot by citizens. As you can see, it says Amendment 79. Amendment 79 deals with the constitutional right to abortion. It requires 55% of the vote to pass. It does two things. It would make abortion a constitutional right in Colorado. And it also repeals the existing constitutional ban on state and local government funding for abortion services. That ban was put into place in 1984 by a citizen initiative. Some background on this measure is that in 2022, the legislature passed a fairly broad abortion protections in statutes, make it to the constitutional level. So while this one is very fraught, it basically does the two things, which makes abortion a constitutional right in Colorado and repeals the existing constitutional ban. I will be clear that just because the existing constitutional ban on state and local government funding is gone, doesn't necessarily mean that the state will immediately begin funding abortions. That will be a decision for the legislature and local governments to decide for themselves. So that's Amendment 79. Yeah, I'm sure there may be some questions.
None trickling in just yet, but I think to your point, we can pause for another moment here. Yeah, okay, yes, there we go. A handful all at once. Could you share a little bit about the Medicare portion of this?
So Medicare is a federal program, as you know, and they also have a ban on funding abortions. There is an exception in Medicare for the life of a mother, which we currently do in Colorado. As I said before, if abortions were to be covered under Medicare, that would have to be a decision of the state legislature. So while this measure repeals the ban, it doesn't automatically mean that abortions will be funded under Medicare or Medicaid.
Sorry, yes, good clarification. Yes, thank you. Yes, and somebody made that point in the chat, so I will, or in the Q&A. Good, well, duly
Medicaid,
noted.
not Medicare. So,
yeah. A couple of questions on to what extent there's any kind of guidance then given in relation to abortion. Both is there curiosity about what state funding for abortions due to medical complications currently or could look like under this, and then if there's any guidelines on timing, how late an abortion could happen.
So the language in the measure is very brief, so it doesn't give a timeline of to a certain number of weeks or anything like that. It just protects the constitutional right to abortion. So it may be up to the courts to decide what that means. As for the repeal on the existing ban, the major way funding will probably be affected is healthcare for state and local governments, their employees actually, and Medicaid, of course. But those decisions will have to be made by the legislature themselves and how much they want to fund. So I can't really speak more beyond that.
Well, good, thank you. Okay. There was one other question that I've kind of just asked that person to give a little more clarity on to make sure we're answering it correctly, but don't see any others in the Q&A at the moment. I'll pause, I don't know, 10 more seconds just in case somebody's still tippy typing. Okay. Thank you very much for your clarity on that. Let's go to 80.
So you get me again on constitutional right to school choice. So this is once again put on the ballot by a citizen initiative, and it passes with 55% of the vote. Amendment 80 does several things. First, it creates a right to school choice for children in K through 12 schools themselves. It also, I want to be clear that under certain rules, parents have the right to direct their education of their children. This just merely enshrines that in the Constitution. And the other thing it does is define school choice to include your public schools and charter schools, private schools, homeschools, open enrollment options, and what the measure says is future innovations in education. We don't exactly know what that means at this time, because there's going to be future. And so the background on this is that Colorado has a very robust school choice system. It has had it since 1994. We were one of the first states to really broaden school choice. The effect of the measure is not much currently. Nothing will change we think immediately for the school and districts and enrollment policies of the students in your school districts. It will just be in the Constitution. What this means for the future related to things like public funding for private schools will be determined probably up to the courts and the legislature on what they want to do with that. But this measure, currently as it stands, just places these rights in the Constitution for school choice. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, folks, any questions on Amendment 80? All right. Jordan is asking, what's the difference from the current definition of school choice or from how it's currently in law?
Yeah, it's not much different. I think the difference is that since it's enshrining it in the Constitution, it includes a lot more things than school choice includes right now. schools, which is not currently in the definition. Though in Colorado, you are more than welcome to homeschool your child. That's not a problem. I think it on the practical level, the definition isn't that much different.
Thank you. And oh boy, okay, there's a whole bunch coming in at once. Let's see if I can effectively summarize. I think there's some questions about what this looks like for schools. If they're allowed to kind of hit a maximum or things like that, if there are folks who are, if one school is really loved by a lot of people and there's so many requesting it, things like that. So kind of thinking about it from the school perspective. Again, knowing that perhaps this is not explicitly addressed in what's on the table here.
Exactly. So that is not addressed by this measure specifically. It just gives people the right. So I think in the current system, it will work as it currently does, which is school districts have their own policies about, school choice, open enrollment options, all of those things. I don't think that will change. I think the legislature, which is in charge of school funding, could decide to do different things. But I don't think I don't think it in the immediate will change how open enrollment and schools are funded in Colorado.
Great. And I just realized I've been a disembodied voice passing along questions this whole time. One thing I will note is that for Junior League members at the October GM, we've got an upcoming a full panel talk on Amendment 80 specifically. So if we don't get to all of your, we won't be able to get to all of your questions. Please bring them in 2 weeks when we have a full in-depth discussion of this. With that, and I know you kind of mentioned this doesn't really affect public funding through this measure, so I'm going to go ahead and mark those addressed for now. And then just very high level for this last one, just high level pro con for this.
Yeah, so as we said, the pro is that school choice is enshrined in Colorado's Constitution. They can't take it away. The legislature can't change the definition. It'll be in the Constitution, what it'll be. The con that we use in the Blue Book is that this leaves a lot of uncertainty for school districts and schools and what it means for the future for the funding of schools, and it conflicts with some of other things in the Colorado Constitution. And so it could ultimately, after many steps in legal interpretation, lead to the public funding of private schools.
Okay, I know that this is a hefty one and we could probably get into the nitty-gritty even further on these questions, but I think in the interest of time, let's go ahead and hop along to the next one. Again, and I'll note that we'll get a chance to get a little bit more in depth on this with the panel discussion coming up in a couple of weeks. And I think I've gone too far. Okay.
On Proposition JJ.
All right. Oh my God. Okay, there we go.
This is about tax revenue from sports betting. It's a proposition and it comes from the legislature. These two questions from the legislature are tax questions, so they don't actually add anything to state law. There's some rules in Colorado about how you have to take tax questions to the voters, so that's why this is here. Colorado legalized sports betting in 2019. That was Proposition DD. The state collects a 10% tax on net proceeds. And when Proposition DD was passed, it included a $29 million limit on those tax collections. We are probably going to exceed that by a little bit this fiscal year, and we expect to exceed it by more in future years. So this measure would take away that limit and say that the state can keep all the tax revenue from sports betting. That money is primarily used for water plan grants. The state water plan is a plan for meeting statewide water needs in the future. The state gives out grants to water like authorities and special districts and whatnot to meet those water plan goals. The money from sports betting taxes goes towards those grants. So this would let the state keep more of that. If this doesn't pass, the money that exceeds that $29 million limit is refunded to the sports betting operators on whom the tax is currently collected. And that's JJ.
Great. While we wait for any Q&A questions to come in, I have kind of a meta question on this, just thinking about some of the propositions from last year that were similarly, the state has levied this tax on X external entity, and now we're asking to keep the funds to use them for what we're intending to do. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the structure of this proposition, just because this comes up?
Yeah, so this one is a little different than the ones we've had in prior years. This all stems from Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is a part of the Colorado Constitution. I think in the past you've had Greg speak on this panel, and Greg is our reigning expert on Tabor, and it is not me. But one of the things that Tabor requires is when you put a tax increase to the voters, you have to estimate, the state economist, which is Greg, has to estimate how much tax revenue you're going to collect, and then anything over that estimate has to be refunded. So there have been a few measures in the past few years. There was one on nicotine, I forget what the other one was, where the collections exceeded that estimate that we put in the Blue Book, and that meant we had to come back and ask to keep the excess revenue. This one, the limit was actually in Proposition DD. So rather than an estimate, the legislature sent this one to the voters with that limit in it. And then we also exceeded that limit. So Tabor has this structure where if you exceed a limit, you have to refund the money. A lot of the times you'll see those as like actual Tabor refund checks. In this case, because the tax is levied on these sports betting operators, the refund would go to them. But yeah, it's a function of Tabor that you keep getting asked to keep the excess tax revenue on these things.
Thank you. Allison has asked, is there ability for sports betting tax revenue to be reallocated in the future? Or is this the direction that these funds go to?
This is in law, so the legislature could change it, the allocation of the funds. It's there's like a little bit set aside for administrative expenses, but the rest of it in law goes to the water plan. Yes, I think that the language could be changed by the legislature. They're really, I would say, generally pretty pleased with their water plan funding from this. So I think it's unlikely, but not impossible.
Okay. And then one of our our favorite Tabor clarifications. So how clear is the language that the excess funds would absolutely go back to the companies rather than into a Tabor check or back to taxpayers? And a little bit, can you like explain why a little bit?
So these tax questions are part of like a larger bill that addresses the topic. This is sort of in the weeds, and I'm sorry, but like the language of the whole bill is not sent to the voters because it's changes to statute that the legislature has the authority to make. So it's only this tax portion that goes in there. And I believe that the language about it being refunded to the operators is in that larger bill that brought out this question. And that full text is linked on our website, leg.colorado.gov/bluebook. We have a bunch of supplemental material there, including long fiscal notes, but it includes the referring legislation on this one, which is House Bill 24-1436.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then last question, hopefully a pretty brief one on this one. Nicole has asked, does the water plan include support to fight wildfires? Or I guess more broadly, what are some of the things that is meant by water projects?
Yeah, so we list these in the Blue Book. The categories that are eligible for water plan funding are environmental and recreation, water storage and supply, conservation and land use, agriculture, and engagement and innovation. So under that environmental and recreation category, there's a watershed health. I think wildfires are really detrimental to watersheds. So I suspect that someone could put together a compelling proposal for funding for that. I don't know if it specifically has been. We also link to the Colorado Water Conservation Board that gives out these grants, and you can see exactly what projects they've funded since 2017 when they started these grants.
Super. Okay, let's go to Proposition KK.
Okay, Proposition KK. It is a excise tax. It was put on the ballot by the legislature, and it is an excise tax, which means that the tax is on the firearm sellers, not the person who buys the firearm. And it's the excise tax of 6.5% of their sales of firearms, firearm parts, and ammunition. And it exempts, this is the Tabor part, it exempts this money from the state revenue limit as a voter revenue change. And it also uses this tax to fund a variety of programs. We kind of put them in big categories. There's a part off the top for administrative costs. The bulk of the money goes towards crime victim services. Then some money goes to veterans mental health services, children and youth behavioral crisis, and the school security disbursement grant, which is just school security related things in schools. Since it was put on the ballot by the legislature, it passes with a majority vote. And so basically it is a tax. I will say that the federal government has a similar excise tax on firearms, firearm parts, and ammunitions. They use that to fund wildlife programs. The only other state that has this firearms and statewide firearm and ammunition excise tax is California. They passed it last year, so it hasn't fully gone into implementation, but they use it to fund a variety of services as well. It's estimated to get about $39 million in revenue in its first year. So if we exceed that $39 million, you might see it on your ballot again if it passes. So that's kind of the Tabor part of that. But that's Amendment KK, or Proposition KK.
Okay, a couple questions coming in. Similar, I think, to the kind of question that was posed in the last one. Is there anything that prevents the legislature from changing where money goes to once this is passed, or if this is passed?
So that part is in statute, so they can change where it goes. I will say that the legislature is usually pretty heeds the word of the voters. So it could change, but it probably likely will not.
Thank you. And two questions kind of in the same vein that I was asking about, yes, this is a tax that is going onto the seller. Are there concerns that this would just then really look more just like extra cost onto consumers to try and offset that?
Yeah, that is one of the arguments against Proposition KK that we make in the Blue Book, that it will trickle down to people who buy and legally use firearms, and it will just raise the cost of that. But, you know, that is yet to be seen, and the tax itself is just on the firearm sellers.
And since you've kind of mentioned actually, we'll go with Jamie's. We'll go with Jamie's question, which is kind of trying to understand why this would why now this is proposed. She says, is it because federal funding for these kinds of programs was cut? So how much is funding being cut federally compared to what would be raised by the state? Basically, to what extent is this replacing funding that has sunset?
Yeah, that I will say, based on the testimony before the legislature, was a big reason that this was put on the ballot. Funding for crime victim services, majority of it comes from the federal government, and it is just declining year over year. I don't know the exact percentages, but this is a way for the state to supplement that funding that we don't usually fund because the federal government funds. And I will say that some of the COVID-19 funding went to these services, and that is expiring as well.
Thank you. All right, let's keep on moving. You all are doing a fantastic job. Thank you all for keeping the questions coming too. Proposition 127.
All right, so from here to the end, these are all statutory measures placed on the ballot by citizen initiative. So this is the first of those. Proposition 127 prohibits bobcat, lynx, and mountain lion hunting. These are 3 different big cats. If you want to jump ahead slide, I put in some pictures of these 3 big cats. The measure refers to trophy hunting, but it defines trophy hunting essentially as hunting. So in effect, this prohibits anyone from hunting these cats. Lynx are an endangered, threatened species. It's already illegal to hunt them in Colorado, so this really only changes the law for mountain lions and bobcats at this time. Bobcats count, how do I want to explain this? Every species that can be hunted in Colorado has different regulations. Those are put together by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Bobcats are fur bearers. They're like a smaller species hunting license. Mountain lions are big game, so requires a different license. There's more of a limit on how many can be hunted each year. We have a big table in the Blue Book with more information about each of these and how the hunting of each of them is regulated currently. If you want to jump to the next slide on this, I just have pictures in there too. Yeah. I think that's all I have on this one.
Okay, I wasn't sure if the pictures were just for aesthetic representation, so we can all picture what these animals look like, or if there's more.
Yeah, I personally haven't seen a lot of them, so I thought it was helpful to see what they look like. And we can't put color pictures in the Blue Book like this.
Okay. So there's some questions on whether this is at all related to overpopulation or anything like that. Are bobcats and mountain lions overpopulating the state, or is there some other reason that you would want to?
CPW currently considers these both bobcats and mountain lions to have stable populations in the state. We estimate between 3,800 and 4,400 mountain lions. Bobcats are harder to get an exact population number on, but they are widespread in the state. They might be increasing in some areas. It's a stable population. I don't think either are currently identified as being overpopulated. Hunting is used to control populations, but obviously, animals kill each other also. So when you address one animal in the food chain, you can have trickle down effects on others, and something that isn't overpopulated could become overpopulated.
Great. And I think kind of related to that, somebody has asked about kind of what's the opinion of Colorado Parks and Wildlife on this, in particular mountain lions, if they've weighed in on what impact this would have.
I don't think that they have taken a position on this particular measure. I do think they have wildlife management experts who handle hunting licenses in the state on a pretty specific case-by-case basis for different species. But I don't think they have specified a position on this measure.
Great. And then I think there's a couple questions that have come in just in relation to self-defense. Basically, is this a concern if somebody comes and attacks your dog and you shoot it? Does this apply to that, or is this really just focused on proactive, I suppose is the word, hunting?
Yeah, the measure defines some things as not unlawful. So those would still be legal opportunities to kill these animals. And they are in the defense of human life, livestock, personal property, or a motor vehicle, by an employee or contractor of any federal, state, or local agency acting in an official capacity or with a special license from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, as a result of an accident involving a motor vehicle, vessel, or train, and for scientific research or humane euthanasia. So I think those exceptions are intended to cover things like self-defense or attacks on your kids or your dogs.
Great. And this is, I think, among the most questions we've gotten on any single one of these. So our Ponte and Busan friends noted that animal ones always get people curious. So I'll try and summarize and probably just do like one more. And I suppose these kind of high level questions on what is the argument in favor of this measure, and kind of the motivation. Yeah, what is the motivation for proposing this measure?
We put two arguments in favor of this in the book. The first one is about hunting causing pain and trauma for animals, and is inhumane. The second is that these populations can regulate themselves, and that hunting and trapping doesn't help regulate the population and isn't necessary. And leaving them alone allows them to provide ecological contributions to the state. The arguments against that we identified, the first is that this limits Colorado Parks and Wildlife and their wildlife management experts in their ability to make science-based decisions. And then the second is that hunting licenses are a revenue stream for the state wildlife management system. And if you take away those licenses, they lose money. There's also a bit on this that I didn't touch on, where in law right now, if a big game species causes damage to a landowner, to their crops, fences, livestock, they can get some reimbursement from the state. So this would make mountain lions not classified as big game, so you wouldn't be able to get those state reimbursements if a mountain lion caused damage to your property, if this were to pass. So that was also included in our arguments against.
Thank you. All right, we just continue to keep having more of these come in.
I'll just say one other sort of point on this. Colorado started introducing wolves this last year. It's been a really big deal. It's taken a toll on Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I've staffed the agriculture committee at the legislature for a couple of years, and we've heard a lot about this with ranchers. I think for a lot of folks in the state, this measure is sort of tied up in wolf reintroduction and how we want to manage wildlife, whether we want to sort of leave that to state agencies or sort of take matters into our own hands. And a lot of the arguments we heard about this had more to do with wolves than it did to do with mountain lions.
That's really helpful context. In the interest of time, despite the fact that we've got a handful of questions, I'm going to go ahead and move us along, just knowing
Right.
we've got a little more ground to cover yet. Sorry, friends.
No, we understand. They're big measures that you have to weigh. So I'm going to talk about Proposition 128. It's about parole eligibility for certain crimes of violence. It increases the amount of prison time a person convicted of certain crimes of violence has to serve before they're eligible for parole. Currently is 75%. This measure bumps it up to 85%. And it also does another thing, which is that if a person is convicted of a crime of violence, is not for the third time is not eligible for discretionary parole or earned time. So if you want to go to my next slide, it shows the crimes of violence that it applies to. It's murder, aggravated assault, first degree arson, burglary, things like that. It's important to note that anyone currently convicted would still get the 75% threshold. This would only be going forward for offenders that are convicted if this measure passes. So as you can see, it talks about the current law and what Proposition 128 will do. A big thing, the thing that lots of people talk about in relation to this measure is earned time. So people who are incarcerated can basically earn a sentence reduction if they do meet various behavioral goals, are good stewards in prisons, things like that. And then they can qualify for that earned time. This measure does not factor in earned time in their 85%, that they have to serve 85% of their sentence. Currently, if you serve 75%, that 75% can be lowered because of your earned time, which is not under Proposition 128. So that, as the slide shows, about 220, this affects about 225 individuals that are incarcerated each year for these types of crimes. And that's Proposition 128.
Great, thank you. One question we've got in the chat is asking about what are some of the things that are considered first degree assault. In particular, this person is asking about rape or other sexual crimes.
Yeah, it depends on I don't want to talk about facts of certain cases, but first or second degree sexual assault, which is typically what we think of as rape, is on the list.
Thank you. Someone else is asking a little bit about, even though the law says 75%, is there data on how long violent offenders currently serve before parole eligibility? She had read somewhere that it was closer to 47%. So wanting to kind of get a little clarification on where things currently stand.
Yeah, so this is, as Julia said, one of the ones that I did not work on. But let me pull up the fiscal note here really quick. Maybe it will probably tell me, because it'll probably have a pretty good understanding of how much time they currently serve. Okay. So, well, the fiscal impact doesn't say how much time, but it is estimated that it will increase spending by about $28 million, $12 to $28 million. So it will, I think, based on that, mean that people are staying in the correctional facilities a lot longer than they currently are.
And a couple questions on just clarifying, when you say that it doesn't factor in earned time, this 85%, it's a true 85% of sentence time. This is like at minimum the floor. Is that right?
Yes, they have to serve 85% of their sentence.
Okay. I will happily go back on the previous slide real quick for a sec, because somebody has asked about that. In the meantime, is that 220 people figure that's just in Colorado, not US, right?
Yes, that's just Colorado.
Okay. And then just high level, some curiosity around the motivation for this proposition. Kind of why was it brought? What was the rationale for bringing it forward?
So I have less knowledge on that because it was brought by the Citizens Initiative, not the legislature. I think there was a time where a group of people felt like people were getting out too early and weren't serving their sentences for these certain crimes because the state was just trying to save money by, giving people parole. I don't know if it's wrong or right, but my understanding from the context around this is that they feel that these offenders need to serve 85%, a higher percentage of their time based on the crimes that they committed.
Thank you.
I'll jump in too on this one. The registered proponents on this one is Michael Fields and Suzanne Tahiri. They are part of a group called Advanced Colorado, and they are behind 3 measures on the ballot this year, actually. Amendment 80, which is the school choice one, it's Proposition 128, and then Proposition 130, which we'll get to, which is about law enforcement funding. So they are active in the ballot initiative space.
It's really helpful. And then I think last question, then we'll move along. Somebody's asking about robbery is on this list. Is this just armed robbery, or what does aggravated robbery mean?
Aggravated robbery is a higher crime than other property crimes. I don't exactly remember the exact definition, but usually it involves a weapon.
Thank you. All right, let's hop along to the next.
Sorry, I remuted myself. Proposition 129 establishes veterinary professional associates. This would be a state-regulated profession. The measure leaves a lot to the State Board of Veterinary Medicine in terms of the scope of practice and the qualifications for this profession, but it does say that they would be expected to have a master's level education and work under the supervision or like along with a licensed veterinarian. So currently in the veterinary professional space, you have veterinary technicians and veterinary technician specialists. Those folks are also registered as professionals in the state. They have to have an associate's or a bachelor's degree. The specialists have some specific clinical experience and training requirements. And a veterinarian is an advanced doctorate degree that also requires some clinical experience. And then the law defines a scope of practice for each of those professionals. And the state board helps create those scopes of practice. So they would be left to create a scope of practice for these veterinary professional associates. If the state creates this profession, we would be the first state to have one. There aren't any other states regulating veterinary professional associates, and there aren't any degree programs for it currently in Colorado, although there are some programs available nationally that might qualify depending on how the state board defines the educational requirements. And that's Proposition 129.
Great. So a little bit of chatter in the Q&A about how this differs from some legislation that might have been brought kind of on the same topic previously. Or I guess to what extent was there legislation on this topic previously?
So the licensing and registration of vet techs is pretty new. I think it's within the last like 5 years. There was a bill proposal in the interim last year that dealt with veterinary professional associates. Nobody picked it up and brought it through the legislature. So that did not become law. The proponents behind this decided to take it to the voters instead. I think they felt that they weren't getting the attention they needed at the legislature.
Thank you. And then a couple of questions on kind of what sort of tier or level is this credential intended to be? Is this mid-level providers? And then somebody was curious about whether somebody with this new designation can open up their own practice.
Yeah, so the intent, and again, this is not like spelled out in this measure, it would be a lot left to define, but I think the intent of the proponents is that this would be a mid-level professional similar to how nurse practitioners and physician assistants function in the human medical space.
Thank you.
And as to whether they could open their own practice, I think that they would have to be supervised by a veterinarian. I think in practice on the human medical side, that supervision happens in a lot of different ways. A lot of people see their own patients as mid-level professionals. I'm not sure how that would play out with this particular one.
All right. And then we'll kind of put just one last on this one. Curious about the impetus for this, especially given that this is kind of a unique unique relative to other states.
So, the Dumb Friends League played a big role in bringing this forward, the shelter medicine community. I think there's some concern that veterinary care is expensive and hard to access in Colorado, and it's especially limited for like shelter medicine, rural medicine, large animal veterinary practices, anything but like your cats and dogs along the Front Range. It's hard to find veterinary care. So I think their motivation is to get more veterinary professionals working. Existing veterinary professionals would dispute that. So that's sort of the argument on this one.
Thank you. Okay. And there were a couple more in the chat that we'll kind of leave there in case you all are able to weigh in on them asynchronously. But if either way, we should hop along to 1:30.
Yeah, I can type on those while Katie goes
Thank you.
on.
That would be awesome.
Great. So I'll talk about Proposition 130. This is, as Julia said, placed on the ballot by citizens. It's an advanced Colorado measure. It does two things. At first, it directs the state to spend $350 million to recruit, train, and retain local law enforcement officers. And the other thing that it does is it provides a $1 million death benefit to officers who are killed in the line of duty. I want to be clear that they are two separate things. So the direction of the state to spend $350 million there's no timeline in that. So how the legislature would spend that $350 million either in 1 year, they could wait 7 years to do it, is up to the legislature. Currently, our best guess and how it would be given out is through the Department of Public Safety, which is how we distribute most of our grants to local law enforcement. We've provided about $30 million over the past 2 years for this similar purpose. But notwithstanding that, the state would be required to provide an additional $1 million benefit for officers that are killed in the line of duty, whether they are state, such as the Colorado State Patrol or your local police officer at the local level. So that's 130 is pretty straightforward. That's the two things that it does.
Great. Somebody's curious if there would be any proposed changes to training in this funding for recruitment, training, and retention.
Yeah, the measure doesn't specifically outline that. It just requires the state to give out the $350 million.
Thank you. And Nicole is curious where the $350 million come from. Does this raise taxes at all?
So the measure does not say where the $350 million comes from. That will be up to the legislature to determine. It just says that they have to spend $350 million.
Great.
So whether he raises taxes is another question, because at September, if they decide to raise taxes, it will become before you, the voters, once again.
And for context, a couple of folks are curious what current spending on law enforcement looks like.
So most of the spending on law enforcement is actually done at the local level by your county. So that can vary widely from the Denver Police Department to, the sheriff that is in Huerfano County, who, probably doesn't have that many officers and not that much money. The Colorado State Patrol is the main thing that the state funds. And I'm not exactly sure on the exact number, but it's not the largest part of the state budget.
Thank you. And last one before we wrap this up, what is the current, we're gonna wrap this up anyway. What is the current death benefit for families of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty? What does that look
So
like?
a lot of that depends on the officer and where they work. The major pension company for a lot of police officers and firefighters is called FPPA, the Firefighter and Police Pension Association. And they get a benefit based on how long they have served. It's roughly, I think, around 70%. Some counties or other law enforcement agencies have their own pension plans outside of FPPA, and that benefit varies widely. And then Colorado State Patrol are under PARA, which is the state's pension system because they're state employees. They get a benefit from that as well. So it really depends on what type of law enforcement officer you are, how long you have served, and what local government or local or state government you work for.
All right. And is there, and I know I said this last one, but just related to that last point, is there, is it, is it equal or is it equitable intent? Meaning, like, is it the state kind of putting in at the same amount across, across jurisdictions, or more broadly, how would this funding be distributed across the state? Is it proportionally making up? What does that look like?
The 350 million?
Mm-hmm.
Or okay. So the measure doesn't specify, so that would be up to the state legislature as well.
Thank you. All right. Clement, apologies. We are gonna hop to 131. I believe is this the last one we're touching on? Okay, home stretch. Thank you so much.
All right, 131 is the last of the statewide measures. It is long and I have 4 slides on it. It's kind of complicated. But so this, and you've also probably seen a lot about this one because they've already been running a lot of ads. So this would establish for certain races an all candidate primary election and ranked choice voting in the general election. So if you want to go on to the next slide, it's got the list of elections this would apply to. So it's your US senators and representatives and most of your statewide offices, the governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, and all of your state legislatures, senators and representatives. It does not apply to the president, district attorneys, or any local offices. So those would continue to be conducted the same way we currently conduct elections. I also have a note on here that the legislature passed a bill in 2024 to limit when this could be implemented. So they intended for this to go into effect in 2026. Right now, the law says that a bunch of municipalities meeting specific qualifications have to essentially try ranked choice voting first, and it wouldn't be able to go into effect in 2026. It's possible that law could change if this passes, but right now that's where it stands. If you want to jump to the next slide, we can kind of go over the primaries and then the general elections. So your current primary election system, you get a party primary ballot. It's got all the partisan races on it. If you're a registered Democrat, you get a ballot with Democrats on it. If you're a registered Republican, you get a ballot with Republicans on it. If you're unaffiliated, you get, in most cases, both a Democrat and a Republican ballot, and you pick one of them to fill out and vote on. You can't vote on both. That was a change in 2016, I think, to open primaries. With that current system, one candidate per party advances to the general election, and then there's a separate process for unaffiliated candidates. Under Proposition 131, with those covered races, all voters would get a ballot with all the candidates on it, regardless of whether they're affiliated with a party or which. So you could have a governor's race with like 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans and 2 unaffiliateds, and they would all be on the same ballot. You would vote for one candidate per race. And then from that primary election, the top 4 candidates in each race advance to the general election. And then on the next slide, I have some things about how that general election would work. The general election for those races would then be ranked choice among those 4 candidates. So ballots are designed by election officials. This is just an idea of what one could look like. It would be up to them to actually design it, but you would have up to 4 candidates for a race. You would rank them 1, 2, 3, and 4. You don't have to rank all of them. And then when they're tabulating these votes, they're using what's called instant runoff voting. They count all the first choice votes. If one candidate gets more than 50% of the first place votes, they win, and that's the end. If not, the lowest vote getter in that race is eliminated. The people who voted for, or the votes that went to that candidate, are redistributed to those voters' second choice candidates. And then If you get to 50% of the votes in that round, it's done. The person with over 50% wins. If you don't, you go on to another round, redistributing the votes from the lowest ranked candidate. Again, you get over 50%, that's when you have a winner. This sounds like it takes a long time, but it's done by computers using a tabulation system that's like similar to the machines that we use now. So it's instantaneous. It doesn't actually affect like when you get the results of the election. This chart that we included in the Blue Book shows an example of a candidate who didn't start out with the most votes winning the election. That does happen in these races. Most of the time, the candidate who's ahead wins all the time, or like wins all the rounds and ends up winning the election. But we thought it was important to show you how something else could happen. So that's the pieces of Proposition 131. Obviously, there's kind of a lot to it. I'm happy to try and answer some questions.
Okay. You already tackled one of them about logistics, so well done. The next question I'll pose is, do other states utilize this system? Where else is ranked choice voting, especially instantaneous runoff, being used?
So this kind of instant runoff voting is used in Alaska. They used it, I think they've used it in 2 election cycles, but it might only be 1. And I think also Maine. California has an open primary or an all candidate primary like this where they advance the top 2. So the general election is between the top 2 vote getters in the general, and there's no ranking because it's just the higher vote getter of those 2. This is most similar to the Alaska system.
Thank you. And then related to that, somebody has asked, so potentially with an open primary done this way, you could end up with all the options for the general being from one party?
Yes.
Okay. Somebody's asking about pros and cons of this type of voting, and someone else is asking just related to that. Are there concerns that, you know, having a more complicated approach rather than just simple majority depresses voter turnout, or has other kind of impacts on people being confused?
Yeah, so we put 2 arguments for and against in the Blue Book on this one. Our arguments for were that the all candidate primary allows everyone to participate. You know, in a lot of districts in Colorado, the one party has a strong majority. So by the time you get to the general election, there's only one candidate, and people who aren't in that party didn't get to choose that candidate. So this lets more people participate at the primary level. And the ranked choice voting gives people the opportunity to express backup choices and could maybe better affect voter will. So those are our 2 arguments for. Our first argument against is that it is complex and expensive and confusing. There's probably going to be multiple ballots because you'll have some races that are conducted, you know, the current way, and some races that are conducted under ranked choice voting. You'll need a lot of voter education and outreach efforts to explain it to people. And if they're confused, they might fill out their ballots incorrectly. And it could make people wonder whether the results are fair. So that's kind of our confusion argument. And then the second argument against is just that political parties have an important role in the political system as it exists right now, and they should be able to pick their candidates.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for digging into a confusing topic with a lot of clarity. We really appreciate it. And it means that we are coming to the end of our time with you all for the evening. Thank you both so much for your expertise and for your thoughtfulness in all of these explanations. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you.
Thank you, and feel free to reach out if you have any more questions.
Yeah, we put our phone numbers on there. There's also a phone number in the Blue Book, and we have actual people who answer the phones, and we won't give you our opinions, but we'll try really hard to answer your questions. And we can funnel them to experts if you asked us something and we were like, we don't know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. time to pivot to our other set of experts for the evening. Let me make sure I've got the right spot to introduce them. Here we are. This note that we've left here, right? Make sure that you remember to vote after all of this voter education. Did I go past you all? Sure did. There we go. So now we've got Julia Scanlon and Iris Hensey from Aponte and Busam. You may recognize them because they are around a whole lot. Aponte and Busam supports the Junior League's Public Policy Council with the work that we do. And so I will briefly introduce them among my many screens here. Yeah, 1 second. There we go. All right, so maybe while I'm waiting for that to load. Sorry.
You're killing it, Allie. You've been doing an amazing job.
Well,
I can
technical
juggle this many
difficulties come for
screens.
us all, don't they?
Hey, it's not a Zoom if there's not a problem.
All right, here we go. Here's their bios. Let me tell you a little bit about Julia and Iris, and then I'll let them talk. Julia has a love for problem solving and has enjoyed the challenge of navigating the Colorado state political and legislative system for the past 7 years. She's become well acquainted with state politics after working both on local and state campaigns. Her experience includes working for several legislators at the state capitol. She also provided logistical support for other Colorado state lobbyists, and most recently for former Governor John Hickenlooper in his Office of Legislative Affairs. She holds degrees in international studies and public policy, along with a master's of public policy. And Iris, let's tell you a little bit about Iris. Iris brings nearly a decade of diverse public policy experience to the Aponte and Busam team, where she mainly covers health and human services issues for clients. Prior to joining Aponte and Busam, she worked at the Colorado Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, or HCPF, the state agency that administers Colorado's Medicaid program. While at HCPF, she led the department's work responding to external bills, analyzed bill proposals, specialized in advocacy for the state's agency's budget, and helped the department engage with many complex stakeholders in the legislative process. Prior to that, Iris worked as a nonpartisan policy analyst at the National Conference of State Legislatures, focusing on employment and labor policy. She got her start working for a lobbyist at the Colorado General Assembly and as a legislative intern. Iris has a bachelor's degree in political science and economics from Colorado State University and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Colorado, Denver. Fantastic. These brilliant ladies are going to tell you about what's happening on the Denver ballot. Thank you so much, Iris and Julia, and I will get out of your way so you can share your own slides.
Thank you, Allie. And huge kudos to Allie for an immense job tonight and all the ladies who helped put this together. For anyone who's gone to a previous Wine and Ballots night, this is a little different in that we want to go over a couple things in terms of endorsements the league has given already, and then we're going to give you the quickest of highlights from a couple issues that the Public Policy Council has chosen from the Denver ballot, because don't worry, if you thought the state ballot was long, fear not, the Denver ballot is even longer. So you'll have another handful of measures to get through. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and we'll talk endorsements first, and then get into just the 3 ballot measures we're going to highlight tonight. So don't fear, we won't keep you too long. We're going to make that 8:30 deadline. So number 1, want to go over the first of the statewide ballot endorsements that the league has decided to take. If you have any questions about the process, how we got here, board approval, any of that jazz, please feel free to pop those in the chat or reach out to our VP of Public Policy Council, Brenda Garcia. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. And without belaboring too much of the point, because hopefully you were paying attention earlier when our experts talked about Proposition KK, the firearms and ammunitions excise tax. So this is the first measure the Junior League has endorsed from the statewide ballot. The rationale here is the JLD's commitment to disrupting the cycle of systemic poverty for women, families within the Denver area. So the reason that the council elevated this and asked for support from the full league was, we had this question during the presentation, the direct impact to services and funding, not only for crime victim services, but also youth mental health services and military veterans. So particularly vulnerable populations who have seen a significant decrease in federal funding, coupled with the fact that we know that the usage of guns occurs more 86% of the time in domestic violence related deaths in Colorado. So between the likelihood of women and children being impacted by additional funding, the league has highlighted this as one that fits well within our mission and would like to see additional funding going towards this measure. So we've endorsed the measure, we're part of the campaign, and we hope that you'll choose to vote yes. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on this one. Then I'll pass it over to Iris for our next measure.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you all for having us this evening. So I, again, won't really go over this measure since we already heard the great presentation from LCS staff on it. But our rationale for why JLD supports this measure is that abortion access directly ties into our mission by influencing the economic mobility and stability, especially for low-income women and families. The restrictions on abortion services can have, negative impacts on women's economic mobility, especially those that are already coming from a lower income bracket. And it can limit their ability to break out of poverty and cycles of poverty. This amendment is crucial in advancing our goals for women and families. And just a couple of data points that helped inform the league's decision to endorse this ballot measure include that according to data from organizations like the Colorado Health Institute, about 1 in 4 women of reproductive age in Colorado are enrolled in Medicaid. And over 114,000 women and 85,000 children in Denver are on Medicaid and would directly benefit from this amendment by gaining access to abortion services and potentially down the road public funding for abortion services. Julia?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Iris. So we're going to hop right along to what are you seeing in the Denver statewide, citywide ballot. So if you're worried that you haven't gotten a city blue book, which is their version of the nonpartisan review, don't worry, those are supposed to be coming out next week or so. So you'll have another long packet for you because there are 9 referred measures, 2 citizens initiated measures, and then 1 extra special 12th measure. If you happen to live in the ballpark area, you'll be asked about a downtown Denver development measure. Our one-pager, which we have in the chat and we'll post after, gives a little bit more details on the measures that we're not going to cover tonight, plus explains where you might be able to go for additional resources, both partisan and nonpartisan news coverage. So don't worry, we're only going to go over 3 in the next 15 minutes. And then we've given you our best foot forward in tools for success for other things. Really quick without getting too in the weeds, I think kind of the best way to explain referendums and a city charter amendment versus an ordinance is that if you were paying attention to earlier, the difference between, an amendment to the Constitution and a proposition, similar for municipal elections. So you can have things referred by city council. There's several top priorities in this one from Denver Mayor Mike Johnston. So you have certain things that are trying to change a city charter amendment. So think of that as more like city constitution, and then an ordinance is more like the law. So there's a lower threshold for changing the law, which can then be adjusted by city council, and a higher threshold for changing the city charter amendment, so that a little bit more red tape when you want to change the city charter. So much lower threshold than the statewide ballot in terms of signatures, though. So probably why, if you're wondering why you didn't get asked about, the fur ban, because that's a much lower threshold for signatures compared to the number of citizens living within the city and county of Denver. Gonna pass it back to Iris to do our first question.
Thank you so much, Julia. So the first question that we are going to go over on the Denver ballot this evening is referred question 2Q, the Denver health sales tax. A yes vote on 2Q would increase the city's sales and use tax by a rate of 0.34%, dedicating the revenue derived from the tax increase to fund services provided by the Denver Health and Hospital Authority. Denver Health is the largest provider of healthcare services to Medicaid patients, not only in the city and county of Denver, but in the entire state of Colorado. You'll often hear it referred to as the largest safety net hospital in Colorado because patients on Medicaid from all over the state end up oftentimes being transported to Denver Health in Denver for life-saving care. The tax increase would generate an estimated $70 million each year in funding for Denver Health, providing important budgetary support to a system that has been struggling under increasing demands and expenses in recent years. Next slide, thanks, Julia. So what will Denver Health use the estimated $70 million in new funding for the sales tax to support? Overall, they plan to use it to help pay for the current demands on the system and to help cover care in the following categories. It'll support emergency and trauma care, ensuring everyone in need has access to life-saving emergency room care. It will support primary medical care, providing essential healthcare services to all Denver residents through primary care offices that Denver Health has. It will go towards supporting mental health care, which they hope to expand access to the mental health services that they provide to children and adults through the measure. It'll go to supporting recovery support services and supporting those seeking treatment and resources for recovery. And finally, it will go towards pediatric care, both providing healthcare services to children in Denver public schools, as well as to children in clinics throughout the city. Next slide. So in recent years, Denver Health budget has been stretched thin to accommodate the growing need for healthcare in the community. Denver Health's expenses have grown 550% since the 1990s, due mainly to increased population, but also due to rising healthcare costs and to increased costs of adequately paying healthcare workers. Meanwhile, the amount of funding the system receives from the city and county has remained flat at only $31 million per year since 1996. So expenses have really gone up, but funding from the city and county has remained the same as it was in the 1990s. In recent years, the system has relied on the system has relied on various financial streams to help close the funding gap, including philanthropy and small bailouts from the state. But $5 to $10 million here and there each year is proving not to be enough to keep their financial ship upright and to keep the system kind of going in the right direction. Denver Health also serves the highest number of patients in the Denver metro area who are on Medicaid, uninsured, or who utilize self-pay to fund their healthcare expenses. This means that they receive lower from Medicaid to no reimbursement for the care that they provide to their patients, because hospitals can't just turn away patients who are in need of care, even if they are uninsured or can't afford it per federal law. Denver Health racked up nearly $102 million in uncompensated care in 2023 to Denver residents, which is a threefold increase just over what they accrued in 2022. And uncompensated care is just that. It's the hospital providing care at no cost to patients without any reimbursement because they cannot afford to pay or they don't have insurance. And next slide. So here's a visual of some of the numbers we're discussing related to the initiative. Again, Denver Health has racked up about $102 million of uncompensated care in 2023. The total budget for Denver Health is $1.3 billion in comparison to the general fund for the entire city and county of Denver, which is $1.6 billion, and the budget for Denver public schools, which sits at $1.2 billion. And then finally, Denver Health is one of the largest employers in Denver, employing over 8,000 individuals.
All right. And Iris, I've got one question in the chat saying, and you kind of touched on this, if you're not a Denver resident, will Denver Health provide care if you end up there with a traumatic injury, and you're not on Medicaid? So
Yes, they definitely will. They don't turn anyone away.
So there you go with increased need. And I think that was all your slides, correct?
I think I have one more
You have one
slide,
more. I lied. There you go.
or two more, but I'll go through them pretty quickly. So the key arguments for the campaign says that they decided on requesting voters to approve a sales tax increase because they believe it's the least regressive option of the taxing options available in Denver. Their rationale is due to the fact that food, medicine, diapers, and feminine hygiene products would be exempt from this tax increase. They also argue that the sales tax helps balance out the demands on Denver residents specifically, as anyone buying anything in the city and county of Denver is subject to pay the sales tax. So that includes people who don't live in Denver but are here to visit for tourism or, work in Denver but may live elsewhere. They pointed to the fact that over 30% of the sales tax paid in Denver is actually paid by visitors every year. And then final slide, if you just want to move forward one more. Some of the key arguments against is that Denver's sales tax is already too high. Denver has a current sales tax of 8.81%, which includes both state and city sales tax. If Initiative 2Q is successful and adds that additional 0.34% increase, it would bring the Denver sales tax up to a little over 9%. And then apart from that financial side specifically, there is also the small government sort of conservative perspective on the issue, questioning whether or not we should be providing more publicly funded healthcare to patients in the first place. And Julia, I will turn it back over to you.
Brilliant. I'll say, if anyone has questions, why don't you go ahead and just throw them in the chat and we'll leave it to Iris to respond via typing. But we do want to get to those, if we don't get to them tonight, we'll get back to you in our post-meeting notes. So really quickly, we'll whip through the last two that we're planning to touch on. This one's been out there in the news as a key priority from the mayor, so you might have seen it. It is another additional sales tax. So referred question 2R proposes Denver's sales tax be increased by 0.5% to go towards an affordable housing fund. If passed, the tax would generate around $100 million annually for initiatives aimed at addressing the city's shortage of affordable housing. If passed, the tax would make Denver's sales tax rate one of the highest in the region. If voters reject the measure, taxes will remain the same at their current levels. No additional funding will be raised for affordable housing specifically, though. So the city already has initiatives and budget dollars that go towards affordable housing, but if anybody has heard anything about the mayor since he's taken office over a year ago, it's one of his key priorities is addressing affordable housing in the city. So the purpose is to create financing preservation for affordable housing, specifically for households at or above 80% of the area median income. Just a kind of quick sort of what does that mean? Your unhoused folks who really challenged are usually somewhere below the 15% area median income. 80% think your, coffee shop, your day laborer folks. So folks who aren't making, tons of money in the city, that's going to be where the focus of the majority of the money is going towards mixed use developments and homebuyer assistance programs. Impact, and this is according to the Johnston administration, they're thinking that we're going to need about 44,000 additional units in about the next 10 years to keep up with growth within the city, and then the additional cost of living, inflation, all that jazz. So they're hoping that this will close the gap and help with funding over the next, 40 years in theory. What you're going to look at when you look at your actual sales tax is currently it's 8.81%. This is going up to 9.3%. So Don't think if you don't pass this that all of your state sales tax are going away. Those are still going to be there. Additional other sales taxes, like the one described by Iris, are still at play, previous things that have been impacted. And that goes adding 5 cents to every $10 purchased. And it would begin starting next year. So kind of the quick arguments for and against. So what you're going to hear from housing advocates, the mayor's office, is that we need sustainable funding, reoccurring funding, $100 million a year that can't be spent on anything but the most affordable housing for our most vulnerable and our working class folks. Teachers, nurses, first responders, and seniors is, highest priority for the city. But cost of everything is going up in government, salaries are going up, demands for infrastructure are going up. So the city needs to have $100 million just set aside for this. It'll be able to preserve and make investments into the future. Arguments against, and even would encourage folks to look over at the Denver Post has come out with the editorial board with some critiques of the measure. It is not the most detailed in terms of how exactly they're going to spend the dollars. So there's worry that there's potential, implementation concerns. Is this going to be spent maybe potentially frivolously because there's not as much detail on how city council will spend the $100 million? And then, of course, you've got concerns about, unintended consequences of having an increase this high in taxation. Are you disproportionately affecting lower income folks who are going to be feeling the burden of additional tax at a greater way than, higher income folks? That, and then, at what point will the taxes stop? We've got a million different initiatives. There's other tax questions on the ballot for Denver. So kind of where do you draw the line and how much detail do we need? That's sort of the very holistic highlights of this one. Again, would encourage you all to look at the resources we've put onto that 3-pager for more coverage from your local news sources, and then some partisan and nonpartisan coverage. Moving right along to 7A, which is a referred measure from the Regional Transportation District. So as a special district, they're allowed to come to you with their own questions. For the sake of time, we won't get too into the weeds on what Tabor is, but if you've been living here for a couple years, hopefully you've heard the term debrucing. That's all named after the founder and drafter of the Tabor Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So whenever local municipalities or special districts go to the voters to say, hey, can we actually keep some of those dollars? That is called debrucing. So Tabor has very strict revenue limits for state and local governments, formulas it has to follow. Anything that falls outside of those, as you heard earlier tonight with a couple different questions, has to be referred back to the voters. So the quick highlights on RTD, it's been around since way back in the day and been asking for public dollars since way back in the day. So RTD has actually asked for debrucing exemptions in the past. The difference with this measure is it's going to ask for a Tabor exception in perpetuity. So they wouldn't come back to you again if they collect additional tax revenue. It would just say from here on out, any additional tax revenue they collect, they'll be able to keep in-house for various funding of services, employees, expansion, all that jazz. But basically, they had to ask you all for money in order to create additional light rail back in the 90s. All that bond debt is about to be paid off. So unless they go back to you, any additional revenue that they've been collecting would have to be returned back to taxpayers in Denver. Kind of the quick, the funniest thing I've heard in any public discourse on this is the RTD measure. If you think it's bad right now, it could get worse. So if you're already frustrated, like many people are, and I will say the state has looked at several different ways of adjusting how RTD functions and what pays for RTD. Just know, in my professional opinion and hearing from many experts in the transportation space, the lack of, if they get even less funding, the services will be worse, the access to transit will be worse. So if you think it's bad now, just wait if they don't have any of the taxpayer money they currently have been collecting. And generally, people want to have a functioning transportation system. However, I'd say the biggest opposition is, critiques that the measure lacks accountability for RTD. It's been a greater question from the governor's office and the legislature is, you're already mismanaging yourself. How do we know you're going to keep doing better if we allow you to keep this money? We're at 8:30. I will just say it's a complicated one, but generally experts in the transit space feel that the additional funding is going to be vital for RTD to dig itself kind of out of the hole that it's in. But it's not a perfect solution. They're going to have probably bills going this year that go into more detail about how RTD governs itself, how it's funded. So not the last you'll hear in the public space on this one. And I know there were a couple questions in there, but we're going to send all of these out in our post notes so that we'll get you a little bit more details.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much, Iris. And thank you so much, Julia Jackson, Katie, for your insights this evening. It's been super informative. Thank you to all of you who came and listened and participated this evening, all of you participants, especially those of you who stuck around until, in fact, even 1 minute over our time. We really appreciate everything that you all brought this evening. Last reminder of the night, ballots are going out soon. Election day is November 5th. Don't forget to put all this great new knowledge to work. Thank you so much, and we'll follow up with information from this evening later on via email. Have a good night, everyone.